It is a pleasure to join you at the conference on discipleship. Due to the holiday of Passover, I am recording my lecture. The title of my lecture is The History of Discipleship in Judaism from a Biblical Commandment on the Individual to Rabbinic Regulation on the Establishment of Public Jewish Educational System. Among the Jewish people, education has been a core value since the founding of the nation. Throughout the Jewish history, the Torah study of adults and the younger generation has been known to be extremely important, both for the preservation of the religious cultural existence of the people and for its continuity. The sages in the Talmud claim that even for an important need such as the building of the temple, it is forbidden to stop the students' studies since the whole world exists solely because of their study. According to Jewish law, a city that does not take care of the education of the younger generation by establishing institutions for learning Torah should be destroyed. Judaism approach is very radical and advocates the position that without education and Torah study, we have no right to exist. The radical obligation of learning Torah for every Jew, for every father to teach his son, and for every community leader to take care of the education of the younger generation can simply explain the phenomenon that among the Jewish people, it has always been very rare to find those without a basic education. Among the Jews, the greatest shame was ignorance. In this lecture, I wish to discuss the history of discipleship in Judaism and its transition from an individual obligation to a public education system. In the beginning, I wish to say a few words about the centrality of education to Torah study in Judaism. In the central part of this lecture, we will examine the development of the Jewish obligation to educate, the transition from private to public education through various Talmudic regulations. In the last part, I wish to emphasize the special nature of Jewish education. Education in Judaism is a duty and not a right. While modern Western law grants rights to a person, Jewish law advocates a system that imposes duties on the individual or the public. The main difference between the legal theories stems from different worldviews. The secular society created the modern law and placed the individual at its center, while the Jewish society submits itself to a legal system commanded by God. The Jewish religious worldview is based on a concept of duties. Jewish law imposes on the child's natural parents a set of duties arising from the parents' status as natural guardians of their children. This status imposes on the parents, and especially on the father, the duty to educate his sons. Torah study is a central value in Judaism. The Jewish people presented a magical ideological vision to the human race, the formation of utopian society, a society in which the intellectual engagement expressed in the study of the Torah is the central existential experience of all its members. The idea of eliminating the gap between an intellectual elite and the masses is indeed an absolute utopian idea. One can find quite surprising parallels between the vision of Plato's utopian vision. Plato, in the 5th book of his Politeia, presents utopia of an ideal state led by the philosopher king. The only place where Plato's vision of the leader philosopher came to reality is in the Jewish society, which was headed by the sages of the generation. Naturally, it is financially difficult to maintain such utopian society where basically no one works and everyone studies. Admittedly, not everyone is qualified to be a philosopher. Some have other skills and qualification which should be used to support those who dedicated their life to study. From ancient time, the Jewish tradition recognized education as an important and essential element whose purpose is to inherit the heritage, to instill the foundations of the faith and the teachings of the laws. The Bible repeats and emphasizes many times the obligation to educate children in the way of the Torah and the mitzvot. There is an obligation from the Torah on the father and the scholars of Israel, even if they have no children, to teach the children of Israel Torah. The obligation is personal. The father and every rabbi must teach Torah to the future generation. The father's duty is extended in the Talmud to several areas to ensure Jewish continuity. His obligation to teach his son Torah means not only an obligation to teach his son personally what he knows, but to ensure that his son learns Torah. If he knows, he will teach him by himself. And if he did not have the opportunity to learn Torah, he must pay a rabbi to teach his son. To conclude, the duty of education, at least according to the Bible and the ancient interpretation of the sages, was a parental duty, not a public duty. However, throughout the history of the people of Israel, yeshiva, bet midrash, and schools for the purpose of Torah study were formed privately and communally. The midrashic tradition says that even before the Torah was given, a bet midrash was founded by Shem and Eber, where the forefathers studied. After the destruction of the first temple, during the exile, Mordechai founded Bet Midrash for the study of Torah. Such private organizations throughout history depended on the changing economic situation and on the reality of scholars with initiative. But throughout time, the educational responsibility for the children's Torah study in its original form remained in the hands of the fathers. The reality created a situation whereby the socioeconomically weak population couldn't learn, and the Torah remained the property of the aristocracy and members of the upper economic class who could teach their children or hire teachers for them. During the Second Temple period, there was a revolution in the field of education. The sages amended regulations expanding the educational duties. The earliest regulations appear in the Jerusalem Talmud, and it is attributed to the spiritual leader of the nation at that time, Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach, from the 1st century BCE, who amended a regulation that children had to go to school. The Talmud does not explain the motive and the background for the amendment of this regulation and what were its results. There are scholars who seek to understand it using the personality of Rabbi Shimon and the period in which he lived. Shimon ben Shattach, who was one of the leaders of the Pharisees, had to fight on two fronts: against the Sadducees, and who did not believe in the oral and Torah, and against assimilation into the Hellenistic culture. The Pharisees knew that their victory over the Sadducees would only be complete if the next generation inherit the correct approach to the Torah and will study it accordingly to the Pharisees' tradition. Removing education from the sole responsibility of the father and handing it over to the public was therefore the best way to ensure the victory of the Pharisees, who, being the leaders of the public, could determine the educational curriculum in the school. And Shimon ben Shattach, as the leader of the Pharisees, was the one that brought about to the turning point. The Talmud testifies that Shimon ben Shattach succeeded in his fight against the Sadducees, I'm quoting, to restore the Torah to its former glory. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Kiddushin 66a. Since he understood in his wisdom that the key to a genuine change would come through education. The Babylonian Talmud testifies about the existence of 3 regulations whose purpose was to ensure the education of all the children of Israel. The first, the establishment of public education institution in only one place in Jerusalem. The second expanded the number of districts and cities in which public educational institution was established, as well defines the age of the students to 16 and 17 years. The third, the regulation of Yehoshua ben Gamla. Teachers of children should be established in each and every province and each and every town, and they would bring the children to learn at the age of 6 and at the age of 7. Undoubtedly, the most important, significant, and expansive regulation is the third, the regulation of Yehoshua ben Gamla, because the previous regulations did not meet the needs of the public in terms of the age of the students and the geographical scope. Determining the early age to start a child's educational path has many advantages. The process of the students' adaptations to the educational framework is easier in young age, as well as the absence of discipline problem and the instilling of learning habits that will help the students to learn at an older age. Much has been written about the question of whether Shimon ben Shattach was indeed a contemporary of Yehoshua ben Gamla, and while the former was one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the later simultaneously served as the high priest. The dispute between scholars regarding the identity of Yehoshua ben Gamla causes ambiguity regarding his identifications and also casts a shadow on the question of the time of installation of the regulation. In any case, it can be said that the regulation of Yehoshua ben Gamla was amended after the regulation of Shimon ben Shattach, both of which aim was to establish a public education system. It can be stated that at least since the Mishnah period, the matter of children's education is no longer just a parental private matter, but a public matter. The educational regulations and their strengthening over the generations led to the re-establishment of the tradition and acceptance of the oral Torah and to the Torah flourishing of the entire Mishnah period. After the destruction and the strengthening of the Roman influence in the land, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi strengthens the implementations of the Yehoshua ben Gamla regulation and imposes severe active punishments on the cities that did not observe the regulation. The sages also decreed that it is forbidden to live in a city that does not have schools for children. On a personal note, when I arrived in Zagreb in 1998, I realized that without the establishment of a Jewish school that would ensure the study of Hebrew and Jewish studies, there would be no real future for the Jewish community, and that I would not be able to stay with my children for long. That is why I suggested the establishment of a Jewish school, and this initiative was enthusiastically welcomed by the majority of the community board. So in 1999, 4 girls were sent to Israel to study at the College for Hebrew and Jewish Studies teachers, and after completing their studies, 3 of them returned to Zagreb with a teaching certificate. So in 2003, the Jewish school in Zagreb was founded with the support of the Ronald S. Lauder Foundation. We can learn from different rabbinic sources about few opinions regarding the public duty, whether it includes the organization of the educational system and its supervision only, or also the funding, or whether the funding is collected from the parents of the students only and not from the community members. There are also approaches according to which the parents who have the ability pay the tuition fees for their children, while the financing of the tuition fees of students from poor families applies to the community. Sometimes the funding of the education system came from donations of community members who were encouraged by the rabbis to contribute to children's education even more than to synagogues' charity, or by granting an exemption from community taxes to teachers. In practice, the scope of the community's obligation to finance the expenses of the education system sometimes exceeded the basic need to pay teachers for basic education. There were communities in which the community even financed advanced education for outstanding children who came from a low economic background. As a principle, it can be said that the payment of school fees in most communities depended on the family's income and was related to the number of students from each family. The community financed the education expenses in the first stage of education. Special support to children whose parents could not pay the school tuition was given almost always in all communities. Finally, I would like to emphasize the special nature of Jewish education as demonstrated in two aspects: teacher strike in Jewish law and Torah study during the Holocaust. The importance and uniqueness of the children's education and study in Jewish law is evidenced by the opinion of the great Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbinic authorities on the question, is it permissible for the employees of the education system, the teachers, to strike? Both rabbinic authorities ruled that suspension of Torah study in order to raise wages in today's reality is forbidden by Jewish law. Even if the teacher's salary is not appropriate and does not reflect their efforts and merit, there is no justification for abandoning thousands of children to the mercy of the street and canceling them from study Torah because of the salary benefits and improvements of working conditions. Because if a strike does take place, when the students return to class, they will not be able to devote their attention to their studies properly. Despite the severe hardship during the Holocaust, Jews continued to study and teach their children Torah as best they could in the ghettos and camps, drawing encouragement for their studies as the verse floated before their eyes, "Were not your teachings my daylight, I would have perished in my affliction," in Psalm 119:92. In the ghettos, studies continued according to the situation. In the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, in addition to studies in the official institutions, extensive Torah study took place underground in improvised places that included small rooms, basements, and attics. According to various estimates, before the war, there were more than 5,000 yeshiva students in Warsaw. After the occupation of the city, naturally, the number dropped dramatically, but the studies continued throughout the ghetto period. The responsa literature of the Holocaust period reveals the incredible faith of Jews who wished to continue following the Torah even in the world of utter darkness, where the Nazis had declared war on Jews and Jewish values. Rabbi Ephraim Oshry in the Kovno ghetto was asked on August 26, 1942, whether one is allowed to endanger his life for the sake of Torah study. Despite the daily hard work and the terrible conditions of labor, many Jews found the time and will to engage in Torah study, which filled them with hope and encouragement. The Nazis were aware of the moral importance of Torah study and public worship in the synagogue and sought to break the Jewish spirit. Therefore, they decreed the death penalty for Jews who engage with Torah study and public prayers. Rabbi Oshry replied that it is a mitzvah to sacrifice one's life for the sake of study of the Torah. However, he did not order people to risk their life for the sake of Torah study. But on the other hand, he did not forbid anyone from sacrificing their life for this purpose. Rabbi Oshry witnessed that many Jews in the ghetto, including himself, did risk their life till the end of the war and kept on praying and studying Torah in public. In my article, I will bring few more examples of dedication to Torah study from the labor and death camps, where the conditions were much more difficult than in the ghettos. To conclude, in general history, education has always been private, to which the sons of the elitists and affluent strata of society only benefited, while general public education begins to operate following the Industrial Revolution only in the middle of the 19th century. However, the obligation of Jewish education, both parental and communal, is indeed very ancient. It was served as a tool for passing down the Jewish tradition from generation to generation and preserved the people of Israel in the long exile. A tremendous educational revolution happened in the people of Israel during the Mishnah period over 2,000 years ago, when the parental duty of education was joined by a public community duty to establish educational institutions where educators and professional teachers would teach. This obligation has been fulfilled by the Jewish communities throughout Jewish history, including and especially during the time when the people of Israel were in exile under difficult conditions for 2 millennia. By analyzing many rabbinic sources, we learned about the long history and centrality of discipleship in Judaism. Judaism is considering education as parental community obligation and not a child's right. We examine amendment of various Talmudic regulations that led to the transition of the parental private obligation to a communal obligation and to the establishment of a public education system. The funding structure of the Jewish public education system itself required many regulations to keep the system going effectively and with good quality. The revolutionary transition to public education during the Mishnah period did not release the parents from their educational obligation, but rather helped the weak economic class and made it possible for everyone to have a quality education. The parents' role remains important and central in the education of the children and in shaping their personality, especially in emotional and personal matters where the parents have a greater advantage than the teachers. All this alongside the professional educators and the school teachers. For this reason, parents are the ones who are allowed to choose the most appropriate educational framework for their children in terms of the selection of and quality of the study content. In the last part of this work, we emphasized the special nature of Jewish education as demonstrated in two aspects: the prohibition on teachers to strike according to Jewish law and the extreme devotion to education and Torah study during the Holocaust. Thank you and have a successful conference.